My name is Tom Way, as Dan mentioned, and I'll be just serving as the chair for this session and also a reactor. Just quickly, I'm from the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. I work on a variety of evaluation studies there, including ones related to teacher professional development, as well as some of the administration's major programs like Race to the Top and school improvement grants. Just a quick disclaimer. While I work for the department, I do not speak on behalf of them. So everything I say today reflects my own views and not necessarily the views of IES or the U.S. Department of Education. So before we get started on the presentations, perhaps it makes sense for my fellow reactor, Jared, and also the presenters, if they want to just quickly introduce themselves so we know who's who.
I'm Jared Knowles. I'm from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and the same caveat applies to me. I do not speak for the department. My opinions are my own.
Luke Miller at the University of Virginia.
Do you speak for the University of Virginia?
Most definitely. I made sure that I got that approval before coming.
Umut, Özek, American Institute for Research and CALDER.
And I'm Helen, often called Sunny Ladd, and I'm at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University.
Great, thank you. So I think we're in for a real treat this session. We have three interesting papers that fit well into the session's theme of considering the possible unintended consequences of accountability pressure. I think this is especially relevant given all the recent hullabaloo around reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and in particular the role of the federal government in structuring accountability systems. Two of our studies actually seemingly go hand in hand in that they both examine how test score accountability policies impact student behavior. Both papers examine outcomes other than test scores, which I think is probably refreshing to many, especially with the rising interest these days in these so-called non-cognitive skills. Both papers also use the increasingly popular regression discontinuity method to estimate their impacts. It's kind of interesting how back in the 90s, at least in the economics area, it was all about sort of finding these perfect natural experiments and finding that perfect IV instrumental variable. And now it's often more about making sure you've got that valid assignment variable. So in any case, I think one of the key challenges with methods like regression discontinuity is ensuring that the results are understandable and correctly interpreted by policymakers. And that's something we can certainly consider in our discussion at the end if there's interest. But last but not least, our third paper looks at whether more high-ability individuals are becoming teachers over time, and whether that might be a result of changes in accountability policies related to teachers. It's interesting when I hear the phrase unintended consequence, that to me seems to connote something really terrible. But for this particular paper, the unintended consequence might actually be a good thing, which is kind of cool. So in terms of the structure of this session, I was thinking that we would start with Sunny's presentation and then follow that up immediately with Umut's presentation, and then we'll have Jared comment on both of those papers, and then I'll give sort of a couple of minutes if there's any initial reactions from the presenters to his comments. We'll take those, and then maybe one or two questions from the floor about those specific papers. Then we'll move to Luke's presentation, and then I will comment on his paper, and then likewise he'll get a chance to respond with anything that he might have. And then we'll just, whatever time we have left before lunch, we'll just open it up to the floor and take questions about any of the three papers. Okay, so let's get started.
Thanks, Tom. That was a great setup for this session. So we're mainly switching gears to talk about accountability. My co-author is sitting, there's John Holbein, here, PhD student at Duke. Will be on the job market in the fall. Encourage you to talk with him. Anyway, we're talking about accountability pressure and non-achievement student behaviors. So this paper is designed to contribute to the broad literature on the effects of school-based accountability pressure. And I want to just emphasize that this pressure, through programs like No Child Left Behind and various other programs at the state level, are focused on schools. So individual schools are labeled as failing, and that then puts pressure on teachers and administrators, and then it's their challenge to change the behavior of students. Now, what sorts of behavior might we be interested in? Well, the one that's gotten the most attention is student learning, as often as measured by test scores. And I want to emphasize that's not the subject of this paper. There are lots of other papers that do look at effects on student learning. So there are two other behaviors that are the focus of this paper. One is getting kids to come to school, getting them to be where they're supposed to be and when they're supposed to be there. And then the other type of behavior is behaving well once they're in school. So what I mean by that is not fighting, not being disruptive, not being suspended. So Tom used the term non-cognitive skills. We're thinking of these latter two behaviors as proxies for non-cognitive skills. And non-cognitive is a term that's probably misused in many cases, but it means a whole lot of things related to socioeconomic development and character and various other things that are not related specifically to achievement as measured by test scores. So as we set up this paper, we put it in the context of a multitasking framework. We're aware that teachers and administrators have limited time and resources to allocate among tasks. So their primary task, especially in response to an accountability type system, test-based accountability, is to promote student learning or the appearance of student learning. So they have a number of levers to use here to improve they can improve teaching practices, devote more time to content that's tested. They could teach test-taking skills. They could game the system, and there are lots of people in this room who've done a lot of research on how accountability affects all of these. And all of those are incentivized in one way or another by No Child Left Behind. So task 2 would be to get students to school on time. And here, teachers and administrators have some policy levers as well. They can call parents, send reminders, threaten punitive measures. They can do some more positive things as well. They could make school really exciting for kids and try to induce them to come to school. Now, No Child Left Behind incentivizes reduced absenteeism in elementary and middle schools, but not in high schools, and we'll come back to that issue going forward. The third task is to get students to behave well in school and to be respectful of others. And there are some levers that that educators have. They could devote more classroom time to such skills, slow down the content teaching and focus on some of these other things that may be desirable for students both in the present and in their future lives. Or they could set and enforce behavioral norms, as lots of certain types of charter schools do. Key thing, these sorts of policy levers and the task itself are not incentivized in any way by No Child Left Behind. So we have some reasonably clear predictions in the paper related to tasks 2 and 3, that accountability pressure will reduce absences and also maybe tardies, which is another measure that's students coming to school late or to class late. But it probably will increase student misbehaviors. So we're going to look at this empirically, and by the way, I think it's important to look at some of this empirically. There's a lot of qualitative work out there and a lot of anecdotes about how test-based pressure changes student behavior, perhaps in undesirable ways. But we couldn't find a lot of quantitative, careful causal analysis. We're using North Carolina administrative data, North Carolina Education Research Data Center. We're looking at outcome years 2007 to 2012. We've got lots and lots of data at the student level, but then we cluster that to the school level for each of the years. So we're thinking of the treatment as being school failure. So a school labeled as failing, and what that means under No Child Left Behind is the school is not meeting adequate yearly progress. And it's failure in the prior year. So a school is labeled as failure one year, and then we're looking at the student behaviors in the following year. And we've got outcomes of two types. One is just showing up at school, and that's the one that's incentivized, at least at the elementary and middle school level. And then behaving in school is the other general type of outcome that we've got. So methods, and we're basically doing a regression discontinuity approach, but here's how we're thinking about it. We're trying to compare student behavior in the schools that fail the prior year to schools that just missed failing. So as long as there are no real differences between schools right near that cut point of failing, we can draw some causal inferences from the differences in those types of schools. Now, in some of our models, we do include some additional statistical controls to adjust for the possibility that the schools right around the cut point aren't exactly the same. And we do lots of different tests and robustness checks throughout our analysis. But the challenge we have is that school failure under No Child Left Behind is the result of a complicated calculation, a very complicated calculation. As you know, under No Child Left Behind, it's not just a matter of whether all students in the school meet the AYP. There are up to 10 different groups or subgroups, depending the nature of the school, that also have to meet the AYP requirement. And then within any group of students or subgroup of students, there are different ways that the students can meet the AYP. They can meet it based on the achievement levels, they can meet it because of some growth provisions, or they can meet it by paying attention to confidence intervals and the fact that there's some flexibility around the specific requirement. So now that complication in some ways is good for our approach. What it means is it's going to be very hard for individual schools to change their behavior and to game the system so that they're just below failing. And so that's useful for us because when you use the sort of methods that we're using, you always have to worry about whether the system is being gamed. But it's bad for us because it's hard, makes it very hard for us to estimate precisely how close schools are to the cutoff, and we need to do that. We need to have what's referred to as a running variable with a clear cutoff in it. So what that means for us is that we need to use a fuzzy regression discontinuity. We don't have a clear cutoff with a clear running variable, so we can calculate a running variable and then use a predicted cutoff. So our running variable is proximity to failure, and there are a lot more details about this in the paper. Let's turn to showing up at school. So the measures we're going to use for this type of behavior, collapse to the school level, or student absences, and then also student tardies. So I'm about to show you results from our fuzzy regression discontinuity, and I'm going to show you two figures related, one to absences and one to student tardies. And just as you look at these schedules, these figures, I want to emphasize that the failing schools are to the right of the cutoff in the diagram. So, and then we're going to measure the effects of failure right at the cut point between failing and not failing. So here's the first picture. Hard to see a lot of the dots. Ignore the dots. Just think about the lines here. So proximity to failure is along the horizontal axis. The 0 point is the cut point for failure. And then on the right, what we see right at that cut point is the line to the right intersects that cut point below the other. And what that means is that it looks like that the schools that are subject to failure in the prior year, absentee rates in those schools go down the year after the failure. So that's pretty clear finding there. And then with Tardies, we get a similar result, that failure in the previous year leads to a reduction in Tardies in the following year. If we want to think about the magnitudes, we've got regression results presented in a number of tables in the text, but school failure leads to, turns out, a pretty big decline, a 30 to 60% decline in absences, and that translates into about 280 fewer absences in a school on average, or about a half a 0.5 fewer absences per student. With respect to Tardies, the effect isn't quite as big, but it's still reasonably good size, with about 80 fewer Tardies in a school on average, and about 0.2 fewer Tardies per student. So that's, those are our results for this behavior related to getting to school and being there on time. Let's now turn to misbehaviors. In the data we have from North Carolina through various data files, we have information on about 70 types of misbehaviors. And so we pulled out 3 of them, those first 3, fighting, in-school suspensions, and out-of-school suspensions, and then the rest, so the other 67 or so, we've aggregated into 7 constructs. And I've listed our names for them here: disruptive behavior, violent behavior, keep going, possession of controlled items, that's incidents related to having drugs and tobacco in the school, and reportable offenses. So we've got a whole lot of different misbehaviors here. So the result that comes out in a reasonably clear way, but not quite as clear as it did for absences, is that school failure appears to increase most of these misbehaviors. So we're putting the pressure on the school, and then what's happening is children in the school are responding by, some of the children are responding by misbehaving in various ways. I do want to emphasize that not all our estimates are statistically significant, and they do vary a little bit depending on the bandwidth used. When you're estimating regression discontinuity models, the question is, how close to the cut point do you want to be? The closer you are to the cut point, the more likely it is that schools are as good as random on either side, but you then don't have as many observations, so often we expand the bandwidth, and in the paper we've presented results for different bandwidth. And we get quite a consistent picture, but when we expand the bandwidth, sometimes we get a little more precision and therefore statistical significance. So here's what happens. Remember, failing is to the right, so this is suspensions going up in response to pressure. This is fighting going up. And we have pictures for some of the others as well, and results for each of the others. But let me just give you a sense of the magnitudes. Out-of-school suspensions, there was about a 16% increase, or about 21 more per school. Fights go up about 14%. And then for a number of other measures, we also have positive in the sense that the sign is positive, negative in the sense that these are misbehaviors, and you can see some of the estimates there. So those are the overall basic results, and then we look at variation in impacts using a number of dimensions. First, looking at them at schools of different types. So under No Child Left Behind, you can fail, but if you fail twice, then you're subject to sanctions under No Child Left Behind. One might expect that schools that are under sanction and then fail, that they put even more pressure on the students than others. So we do find bigger effects if schools are under sanction. And then I mentioned earlier that for absences in particular, those are incentivized at the elementary and middle school level under No Child Left Behind, but not at the high school level. So we find, consistent with our notion about teachers responding to tasks, that incentivized tasks are going to get more attention. So consistent with that, we find no effects on absences at the high school level. Then we also look at results by subgroups of students. So first, for think about results for groups of students split up by their reading test scores in the prior year or their math test scores. And we do find some differences here. I should emphasize that we have to be careful. Once we look at subgroups of students, we don't have as strong a causal warrant. We can't tell the causal story quite as cleanly as we can for overall. But nonetheless, we think these results are quite suggestive and interesting. We get more reduction in absences in response to failure in the upper quartile of the achievement distribution. You might wonder why that's the case. We don't know exactly why, but it could be that the schools are putting more pressure on those students to come to school, because those students are the ones that are going to lead to higher learning or test score gains for the whole school. And then we find more misbehavior in the upper and lower quartiles of this achievement distribution of students. So that surprised us at first. So it's both the higher achieving students and the lower achieving students who, for whom there are bigger changes in behavior in a undesirable direction. It's misbehavior. And we think, a couple of things going on here. At the lower level, we think it's probably just related to the fact that there's pressure being put on students, and they may not have the capacity to respond to that pressure. There are different stories, and we can talk about this more for the upper quartile. We can come back to that. Let me just continue, because I only have about 30 seconds left. Variation impacts. We have looked at differences by student race and ethnicity. Absenteeism goes down most for the white students, and misbehavior up most for the minorities and mainly African Americans. So here are the conclusions. We do find reasonably clear evidence on schools from failing under No Child Left Behind, and the student behaviors that we observe in response to this pressure seem to be consistent with our predictions. Absences and tardies go down and misbehaviors go up. And then, as I was just mentioning, the misbehaviors tend to go up most for the lowest performers and probably for black students as well. And those are the groups that are most likely to be left behind. And remember, this policy was called No Child Left Behind, but in some ways children are being left behind. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on such a lovely DC day. Before I begin, I must probably disclose that the paper I'm about to present is forthcoming in the next volume of the Education, Finance, and Policy Journal. So no matter how much I appreciate your comments and suggestions on this paper, there's really nothing I can do to incorporate them into this draft. Jared, I'm so sorry. But I still appreciate any comments you might have, especially on future extensions to this paper. So as Sunny mentioned, accountability has become the new norm in education policy over the past 2 decades. During that time frame, we have witnessed the nationwide implementation of an education system where student performance in standardized tests carry significant ramifications for students, teachers and principals, and students themselves. One of the biggest and most common consequences for low performance in standardized tests for students is grade retention. But as we all know, grade retention is not a new proposal. It's been around for a very long time, and it's been a really highly debated proposal to improve the performance levels of low-performing students. Obviously, the biggest point of contention is whether grade retention, whether holding back students who are not ready for more challenging coursework leads to any meaningful improvement in achievement. Earlier studies in this context typically find that retained students perform significantly worse than promoted students in standardized tests. But more recent studies that make use of the nonlinearities in retention policies and therefore better address the selection issues related to grade retention, they find significant benefits of grade retention on student achievement, especially in the short run. The other topic of debate is obviously the adverse effects of grade retention. There are several papers, there are several studies in this context. For instance, Jacob and Lefgren recently found that grade retention during the 8th grade leads to lower likelihood of high school graduation under some circumstances. And there's also another study that looks at the early grade retention in Florida and finds that it doesn't have any significant impact on the attendance rates of students. In this study, I used the early grade retention policy in Florida once again, but I look at the effect of grade retention on student misbehavior in the years following the grade retention. Before I talk about the empirical strategy and the data, let me give you a brief background on this policy. The name of the policy is Just Read Florida. It was enacted in 2001 and it took effect in 2002-2003 school year. So this policy basically tied the grade promotion decision in the 3rd grade to the test performance of the 3rd graders in the reading test, which is called the FCAT in Florida. So students are placed in 5 different achievement levels based on their test scores in the reading test. And if a student fails to score at a level higher than the lowest level, then he or she is retained in the 3rd grade. As with all education policies, and as with most grade retention policies, there are good cause exemptions in this policy as well. So for instance, even if a student fails to perform at the required level, he or she is promoted to the 4th grade if he or she demonstrates sufficient proficiency on an alternative test. In addition, limited English proficiency students with less than 2 years in the ESOL program are promoted regardless of their performance in the 3rd grade test. Special education students with certain disabilities are promoted. If a student demonstrates proficiency through a teacher-developed portfolio, this basically implies that the teacher of the student prepares a portfolio showing that the student actually can read at the grade level, even though he or she failed the FCAT. That student is promoted to the 4th grade, and if the student has already been retained twice between kindergarten and the 3rd grade, then he or she is promoted to the 4th grade regardless of the test score. So the data I used in the study is the student-level administrative data from Florida. I followed 7 cohorts of first-time 3rd graders between 2003, 2004, and 2009, 2010. To give you an idea about the size of the data, the sample size, these 7 cohorts of students correspond to approximately 1.4 million unique students. The data set includes the usual suspects, the student demographics, LEP, and special education status, which are important to identify which students were used the exemption clauses, and the test scores, the FCAT scores in reading and math, along with the student disciplinary incidents, which obviously is the most important piece in the study. Unlike Sunny's great North Carolina data, the unfortunate thing in Florida is that we do not observe the type of incidents, types of behavior that triggered the disciplinary record, unless the behavior falls into these severe incidents, for instance, gang involvement or sexual offenses or offenses involving weapons. And thankfully, elementary school students are not involved in those very severe incidents, so that doesn't apply to this study. But other than that, we do observe for every reported incident in the public school system, we do observe the disciplinary and referral action taken, and the duration of the suspension if the student is suspended. And there are a number of options. Well, these referrals and disciplinary actions are all based on the teachers and the principals, and they might include corporal punishment, in school or out of school suspension, placement in a different program, or expulsion. So when we look at the disciplinary incidents across grades, three patterns emerge. One, disciplinary incident rates increase monotonically across grades. So from kindergarten to the 12th grade, we see higher rates of incidents as we move up. And there are significant jumps between elementary grades and middle grades and middle school and high school. This is probably due to the fact that the principals and teachers pay more attention to disciplinary incidents at different grade levels. So the same behavior might trigger a disciplinary incident in middle school, whereas in elementary school it might just be a warning or something that doesn't go on your record. Another pattern we're talking about is that corporal punishment was more frequently used in earlier grades, probably because it was easier. In the later grades, as kids get bigger, it was probably more difficult. Corporal punishment was more difficult. But obviously it wasn't the case. The reason was corporal punishment has become less frequent in later years in Florida. In earlier years, it was more frequently used. And about 80 to 90% of disciplinary incidents result in suspensions. So pretty much every incident that is reported either results in school or out of school suspension. So the outcomes I'm interested in this study are the likelihood of being involved in an incident and the severity of the incident as measured by whether the kid received an in-school or out-of-school suspension. But keep in mind, when I use the number of suspended days as a measure of severity of the incident, the results are pretty comparable. As you might have imagined, and as you know because Tom mentioned, I use this regression discontinuity design. This is a fuzzy RD design because of the good cause exemptions. So basically what I do is I compare the students who scored right below the retention cutoff to those who scored right above the retention cutoff. I estimate this parametrically. The reason is that the running variable is discrete and non-parametric estimation might lead to biased estimates. In the preferred specification, I limit the students to those who scored within 5 and 20 points around the cutoff and use linear or quartic polynomial orders. Standard errors are clustered at the selection variable level, and I also check the sensitivity of the findings to different bandwidths and polynomial orders. So this is the first graph I'll show you. This is the treatment at the cutoff. This is a necessary condition for the RD. So this graph basically shows you that those who scored right below the cutoff were significantly more likely to be retained than those who scored right above the cutoff. The magnitude of discontinuity is about 0.3, which implies that students who scored right below the cutoff were about 30 percentage points more likely to be retained than those who scored right above. And obviously, if we didn't have the good cause exemptions, the magnitude would have been 1. But we did have the good cause exemptions. This graph basically summarizes everything that I will tell you in the next, how many minutes? 10 minutes, let's say. So if you have other errands to run, you can just watch me. 7. Okay. Oh, okay then. So the outcome in this graph is whether the student was involved in a disciplinary incident in the 2 years following the grade retention. So in the 2 years following the first time the student entered the 3rd grade. So what you see is that there's a discontinuity, and I will show you that it is this discontinuity is statistically different than 0 in the later slides. And the magnitude of this discontinuity is about 1 percentage point. So a simple Wald estimator, basically you divide the magnitude of this discontinuity by the magnitude of this discontinuity, and you end up with an estimated treatment effect of 4 to 5 percentage points, which might seem low, but keep in mind the control mean at the cutoff is 0.17. So that implies that the treatment effect is about 25% of the control mean. So this basically implies that the grade retention leads to a 25% increase in the likelihood of being involved in a disciplinary incident. And the natural question that comes to mind is whether these just promoted kids were different than just retained kids in the years prior to the retention. And the outcome here is the likelihood of being retained in the 2 years prior to the first time third graders. And as you can see, there was no significant difference between the two groups in the years prior, but there was a difference in the years after. And these are, I will show you a bunch of tables now from now on, but pretty much I'm going to be telling you the same thing. So this table gives you this short-term effects of grade retention on disciplinary student misbehavior. The first panel is the year after. The second panel is 2 years after. And so what the outcomes I'm looking at is the likelihood of being involved in a disciplinary incident, in-school suspensions, and out-of-school suspensions. The first two columns give you the results for the linear specification with a score range of 5. The third and fourth give you the same thing for quartic specification with a score range of 20. Let's first focus on the first column, so the columns labeled as 1. There are two things worth highlighting, okay? There are two things worth highlighting. The first is that the world estimator was pretty accurate. The impact sizes range from about 3 percentage points to 5 percentage points in the first 2 years. By the way, the columns labeled as 1, I don't control for anything other than cohort fixed effects. The second, the columns labeled as 2, I control for student covariates, which includes the demographics and the third grade math scores. And I also control for within school peer average in the outcome that I examine to take into account the differences in schools attended between just promoted and just retained students. I also use school fixed effects in some specifications to take into account that, and the results are pretty much the same. So the second thing worth highlighting is that in the first year after the retention, there's a significant effect on out-of-school suspension, so just retained students are significantly more likely to be involved in more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension, whereas in the second year, the effect is more concentrated on the in-school suspensions. This is perhaps driven by the possibility that the kids are involved in more severe incidents in the year after compared to the second year after. And the third thing worth highlighting is that no matter whether we control for student covariates or not, the results are pretty similar, which is a good sign here. These are the longer term effects, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years after the retention. Well, as you can see, pretty much the results do not exist. I mean, the estimated impacts are not significant anymore beyond the 3 years. The interesting thing here is that in the third year after the retention, there's a negative effect of grade retention on student misbehavior. But keep in mind, the third year after the retention is the year when just promoted students start middle school and just retained students are still in elementary school. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant jump in disciplinary incident rates between elementary and middle schools. And as you can see in the second column, when I control for within school peer average, those effects are gone. So that's pretty much why we see that. Another interesting thing to look at here, how many minutes do I have? Yeah, 2, okay. This is the same grade comparison. What I've shown you so far was the same age comparison, so I was keeping the age constant and looking across grades. Another interesting thing is to look at keeping the grade constant, looking across age. So basically I'm comparing just retained students with just promoted students when they reach the same grade level. And the results are pretty similar. That's the main story here. With the significant positive effect in the elementary at the elementary level versus pretty much no effect in the middle school. This is the subgroup analysis. As we all know, when we go into subgroup analysis in RD design, things become less precise, and it's really hard to make statistical distinctions between point estimates. So I'm just going to talk about the point estimates now. But keep in mind, these are not statistical. I'm not talking statistically. So the effects are pretty much concentrated among the economically disadvantaged African Americans and males. That's pretty much the story here. Okay, 1 minute. That's good. Obviously, the first question that comes to mind when you look at a study like this is that whether the effects are real, so whether this is the actual impact of the retention policy, or there's something else going on that is triggering the results. One possibility is differences in background characteristics. I compared just promoted with just retained along a number of observables, and they were quite comparable. I'm not going to give you the table here. Another possibility is the manipulation of the selection variable. Keep in mind, principals, teachers, or students did not have a control over the assessment of their tests, so it's quite unlikely here. And I also looked at the density of the test scores, and I did not find any significant jump in the density around the cutoff. And there's also the possibility of differential attrition from the sample, and I did not find that to be the case either. Okay. So the mechanisms behind the effects, just one sentence. I considered three possibilities. One, grade retention leads to an increase in the relative age of the student compared to his peers, his or her peers. The second mechanism I considered was the emotional distress due to the loss of friends, and the third was the stigma effect. And I found evidence, suggestive evidence at least, supporting all these three possibilities. So the takeaway here is basically early grade retention, at least in Florida, has been shown to have significant benefits in terms of achievement, at least in the short run. But I show here that in that short run, there is also the adverse effect of increased student misbehavior among the retained students. As with all retention policies, sorry. Okay, just take a look at these conclusions. I've already run out of time. Thank you for the patience. Thank you.
Well. So I'm going to take the policy reactor part of my role very seriously. So I'm not going to speak to the quality of the methods or concerns about measurement or anything. These papers are really good. I would encourage reading them. And one's already published, and I think the other one is probably well on its way to being published. So I want to say that I think they were both really great reads. And I'm going to address this as if I was trying to translate this research, or I was coaching the authors to translate this research to my bosses, the state superintendent in Wisconsin. And this is something I have to do all the time. I read a research report, or I get sent a research report, and they say, someone asked the state superintendent about this. What does it mean in Wisconsin? Can we do it? Would we be interested in this? So I'm going to use that as a lens to interpret this. So maybe for some of you that might not be as interesting, but you've been warned. The first thing I'll do is start off by complimenting the work. I think that's really important for people inside of government agencies who are using research to also be champions of the research, maybe even sometimes be Pollyanna-ish about the research, because there is sometimes a deep distrust of the research. And so you may want to be more positive, and I always lead off with the positives about research to my policymaking colleagues, because they have some skepticism to start with. So this research is really good, and it actually is really good particularly for policymakers, because it uses observed behaviors of students, which are naturally more trusted by policymakers than things like test scores or even survey instruments. So observed behavior has a lot of credibility within a Department of Public Instruction as something that we kind of trust the data on that. More importantly, at least for Wisconsin, it's really interesting that these both use discipline data. Wisconsin, as you may or may not know, is a state with a lot of school choice. We have public school choice. We have a public voucher program. We have a lot of ability for students to select schools. except for the 380 rural districts where there's no real choice. But for the large urban areas, there's a lot of choice. And one of the most important ways parents choose schools is safety, either perception or actual safety. And so policymakers are increasingly really interested in knowing how we can get accountability levers on safety, because that's going to keep people into public schools or make public schools more competitive with private schools, etc. So that was really great, and there's some interesting ways to use discipline data shown here. The other thing is that both papers did a really great job of trying to break out the effects and try to understand the mechanisms behind them, do subgroup analysis. This is really important because if you stop at the first finding, policymakers immediately will always have a bunch of questions, and those questions usually revolve around subgroups. So they both have anticipated kind of a key next set of questions policymakers will have, and that helps people start to generate hypotheses about the mechanisms. So I think that's a really positive example. Now I will move to the criticism, which is not a criticism of the papers as academic papers, but really about what additional information policymakers would need or would have, or questions that they might be skeptical about the findings. And I'm going to frame that in 4 ways. The first is already brought up in my question to the last panel, which is threats to external validity. How do I generalize from North Carolina to Wisconsin? The second group is descriptions of mechanisms and what the treatment effect really is. The third is variance and heterogeneity in effects, and we've already talked about that a little bit, and the fourth one is measurement. So first, the threats to external validity. Some of these are valid, and some of these maybe you may think are less valid, but I want to just couch this by saying these are all things that would come up in my experience in having this discussion. The first one is, if we don't have the same data available, people are much less interested in doing or learning about or reading research on those topics. That's a big challenge, and I think the federal government's done a good job trying to level the playing field between states. But there is a perception of, well, if you have teacher value added in New York and we don't have it in Wisconsin, we don't really have much reason to read up on the literature that studies teacher value added because we can't see how it plays in our state. I think that's a big barrier, and I think researchers need to be aware of that barrier, and we need to have a conversation about how we can fix that. The second one is that a lot of states, there's a view that their policy environment interacts with the federal policy environment in a unique way or in a way that's different than other states. So what I read immediately in the paper about North Carolina was thinking about what was North Carolina's state accountability system like during this time period. And relative to Wisconsin, I'm going to guess it was stronger because Wisconsin had virtually no state accountability system during the same time period. Would we expect that to be a differential effect? Would we expect that to change the findings we might find in Wisconsin? The other one for the Florida paper, Florida receives a large injection of funding during this period as well. And so, that will make state policymakers sitting in 2013 look back and say, well, gee, we could probably do a really good retention program if we had hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in public schools. But since we don't, would we really consider adopting that policy? So that's in people's minds, and those are very important challenges. The other thing that I think is really interesting is thinking about temporal drift of the effect in this case. So if you imagine No Child Left Behind as causing actors to enter into a strategic game, the strategic game in period 1, period 2, period 3, there's policy learning going on, both by the state and by the local entities. And so what I would expect to see is you may see very divergent paths as different districts make different decisions about AYP and how they're going to respond to it, how they're going to talk about it, and what they're going to emphasize. Because as the paper does a good job pointing out, it's really stressful to try to maximize. It's like whack-a-mole for our education leaders trying to fix this problem, and this problem pops up, and then they try to fix this one. Some of them may be better than others, and that you'll see that evolve over time. So that's an interesting benefit of longitudinal data, which is one of the things CALDER's really focused on. A technical note is that sometimes we will try to poorly or quick or well replicate analyses in our department that we see in other places. But one thing that will get bogged down is the people who are responsible for collecting and guarding the data in our agency will be very skeptical that the researchers perfectly accounted for, this school district's data in year 2007. Did they know about this specific thing that happened in the submission? Now, you can't solve that problem, but one thing to be more transparent is if you were really interested in states using the information is to publish an appendix that details data cleaning or to link to how the data was cleaned and what business rules were used. That would create a transparency that would make some policymakers, not all, I'm recognizing that I'm different maybe than policymakers in other places, but that would give them more ground to stand on when saying, yeah, they did make some very good business rule decisions when analyzing the data. So now I'm going to talk about mechanism, and mechanism I think is important because the way the treatment gets defined really determines how policymakers will interpret the paper. So describing the policy in Florida as a retention program makes people think that all we have to do is retain students in third grade and we'll get these achievement gains, but we'll have this negative effect. But the paper does mention a couple of times that there are a bunch of other services provided around retention. So it's not solely retention. And I think it's an impossible task to put into a research paper to describe it enough for policymakers, but I think it's really critical to think about when you are doing this kind of research that policymakers will try to simplify the treatment effect as well to make their policymaking job easier potentially, or because it's politically expedient to do so. So the Florida model was brought up in Wisconsin. Wisconsin considered a bill to do this exact thing, to do retention, but without any of the wraparound services. And I wasn't involved directly in those discussions, but I did hear that the governor was sort of told, if you don't have money to put into schools, this might not be the best idea, and was kind of dissuaded from doing that. So that's a good example of thinking it's not just retention, so that's an important thing to think about. The other thing about regression discontinuity poses some new problems for us because of the local average treatment effect versus the average treatment effect problem. Policymakers, that distinction is fuzzy at best to them and completely meaningless in most cases to them. So they may say, well, there's a local average treatment effect. That means if I do this, all my schools will have this benefit, or all of these things will happen. And so I think we all need to work together to develop a vocabulary around these kinds of things to make it easier for policymakers to understand that. The other thing is conclusions that are situated within the literature are important, and it's really important to think about how important this specific outcome you're studying in this study relates to other outcomes that have been measured previously. And I think both papers did a good job saying, you know, we're looking at discipline, here's what the literature has said on achievement. But they stop short of telling policymakers, okay, so what is the trade-off between discipline and achievement, and how might you, what research or what way would you appeal to understand how to make that trade-off? And that's not the job of a research paper, but that's a question that's immediately begged from this multi-outcome decision-making framework. The third thing I'm going to talk about is something specific for state education agencies. A lot of what we're actually interested in is quality control. So a lot of the research is focused around the mean effect, and a lot of what policymakers are inherently interested in is the variance of the effect. And so there's a lot of interest in saying, so what's the probability that a school district will make really bad decisions and do something really bad if we do this policy, or they'll make really great decisions and they'll soar if we make this policy? And sometimes we're interested in shrinking that variance, and other times we're willing to grow that variance in order to learn what the best districts do and try to replicate it. But focus on mean effect is important for understanding the overall policy, but naturally, especially in state education agencies, most people come from districts within the state education agency, and they're really thinking about, well, you know, I was in this district and our neighboring district, we had totally different outcomes. How would this policy work in each of those two environments? The other thing I think that's really important is that effect variance also may give us some information about how different places are responding to different policy incentives. And so, you know, there's a tension within our office, and I think in many state education agencies, between viewing school districts as purely rational entities that will game any system that we put into place, and also viewing them as hardworking, talented professionals working under a lot of stress to bring out betterment for children. And those are two fundamental tensions that we have. And so thinking about how the policy would bring out the dark or the light side of the entities that we're regulating is a really interesting idea, and it's something that we would wish we had more information from the literature to extract, I think. Finally, I think what would be really valuable is to start to develop a vocabulary between policymakers and researchers about magnitudes of effects. And what I'm talking about is both papers did actually a great job of this, and I was happy to see, of reconverting their probit estimates or their other estimates back into things that you can translate to a policymaker, because otherwise that's going to be my job, and I'm not going to like that job, and I'm not going to talk about your paper as much. But more importantly, I think it's also really key to be able to say, and how much does that matter? How much is 2 absences a year worth relative to 10 points on a standardized test? that's a challenge for researchers to help us talk about. And the more we take up that challenge, I think the more we can give policymakers those tools to say, yeah, well, this policy will increase discipline, but hopefully in the end it will decrease dropout. And so we may be able to talk about a policy more comprehensively. That's a big pie-in-the-sky goal, but I just put it out there. The last thing I'll talk about is measurement, which probably people who do education research are very familiar with. But there is a deep skepticism, I think, within parts of the education community about a lot of measurements that we use. And mostly lately we see the test score debate. What are test scores measuring? Are they measuring what we care about? But you see it all over. If you implement a survey and you do a research design that has a survey, a lot of times that survey will be under threat, and people will say, well, how do we know that's a valid survey relative to someone else asking? And so, you know, thinking about the validity measurements and how we build the credibility of those measurements with policymakers, I think is really crucial. But I also recognize that it's like running on a treadmill that's never going to stop, because as soon as you get a measure to be accepted, like maybe test scores, then political winds can change or things can change nationally or locally that undermine that same measure and make it hard to keep in front of that debate. But it's important to recognize that, you know, multiple measures or some measures are going to carry further weight with policymakers, and that's why I was commending the observed behavior kind of measure. But there's still threats there that I alluded to about people not trusting how well we actually record the data. But you know, that's one thing policymakers or researchers can say and say, well, if you put in better data, it will give you out better results, and there will be a good sustaining feedback loop. And I'm willing to bet that places where they have a tight relationship with researchers, like what we heard about Spokane and Dan, they probably were willing to say we need to think about how we measure these things better because we can really learn a lot of information moving forward. So those kinds of partnerships do increase the accuracy of our data systems too. And I think researchers who are willing to engage in a measurement discussion with policymakers, you know, it's a long-term bet. It's definitely not going to solve your research problem 2 years from now, and it's not going to solve policy 2 years from now. But in the long term, hopefully it's something better. So I think both papers were great at touching on each of these areas. And what I would say in conclusion is that policymakers are going to be really hungry for all the pieces that you only touch on in your papers. And they're going to be much less interested in your long descriptions of your identification strategy, because we kind of trust you at that, honestly. That's why you're doing the research and we're not. So I think that's an important context to have when thinking about why translating research to policy is difficult. It's partly the medium and it's partly the concerns are very different. But I've seen a lot of good improvement. I've seen a lot of good work in this direction, and these papers were great examples of how you can start to speak to each of those things enough that you raised enough good questions that policymakers would be wanting to have a conversation with you about further analysis or further detail. So I think both the papers were excellent, and I think policymakers and researchers have some ground to share and common interests, and we can, you know, kind of take this as a way to start that dialogue. So thank you.
Thanks, Jared. You've given us lots to think about there. So I just wanted to see whether Umut or Sunny had any quick reactions to Jared's comment before we take a couple questions from the floor.
Yeah, I mean, these were really useful comments. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the external validity of the findings here. I mean, grade retention policies vary incredibly across districts and across states, and this is especially true in Florida, where grade retention in the third grade comes with a wide array of instructional support for those who are retained, which includes offering them summer courses or assigning them to the more effective reading teachers in the following year, or longer instruction. So it's really hard to say if the findings here can be applicable to other contexts in other states. Because it's a very different system. But I think Florida's model of grade retention is a useful model, because I think that there's enough literature examining at least 5 or 6 papers examining the effects of grade retention in Florida, and the majority of these studies find positive effects of grade retention on achievement, with some adverse effects like mine.
All right, thank you. Let's take a couple questions on these two papers. Start here in the front. Want to wait for a microphone?
one over here.
You can take that. This would be the second one.
Got the mic from Mike. But I guess my main question is, when I see student misbehavior, should we really interpret that as the measure that we're looking at? So I see student misbehavior up on the screen there, or is it really teacher behavior that we're thinking about as being the responding variable here? And the way you characterize it in the paper has dramatic implications for how people read the paper as well. I mean, if we think that, for example, a 1.5% increase in attendance produces a few more kids in the classroom on some given days, and that creates some stress for the teacher because these are high-performing but also very demanding kids who are added to the classroom, potentially if they're in the upper quartile. But she experiences more stress both because her school is in danger of failing, but also because there are extra kids in the classroom. Does she then take that out on the African-American boys in the classroom who are behaving exactly the same way, but she now takes that out on them by suspending them, for example?
That was a difficult question. Whoops. Are those misbehaviors reporting artifacts of the reporting as opposed to real changes in behavior? Now, in some cases, it doesn't matter all that much. So if kids are suspended, and it's an out-of-school suspension, we may have to change the interpretation a little bit, but that's still a bad outcome from the point of view of the kids, because they're not in school and not having an opportunity to learn. So
that difference matters. What are we talking about?
Well, it matters. So it's still a potentially adverse side effect of accountability that we might want to pay attention to. So some of our other measures, we never can sort that out precisely. The fact that we've got a number of different measures helps us, we think, in our paper. So take absences, for example. We think absences are pretty well recorded. But then tardies go pretty much in the same direction, and they're similar. And so we can compare results across similar measures or slightly different measures and see if we get similar sorts of things. Same thing for all our categories of misbehaviors. If we put all our weight on one measure, let's say fighting, if all our results hung on the fighting measure, we'd have to worry that some schools are reporting fighting more, say, after the failure of the school than others. But if we have lots and lots of different measures, I think we can gain more confidence in our results. But clearly, it's an issue we need to deal with.
All right. Thank you.
I think that, it's a couple of additional things. Well, Sunny's paper is obviously looking at the cross-school variation, so the comparison is at the school level. I think this is it's still a valid concern because there's the possibility that there's variation across teachers within the school in terms of how tolerant they are towards certain behaviors. But in my paper, I'm able to control for at least a cross-school variation in differences in tolerance by using school fixed effect. So if, let's say, if principal is the main person in charge of assigning these in-school suspensions or out-of-school suspensions, as long as, assuming that he or she is consistent across behaviors, then it's not a bigger issue in my study than Sunny's, I think. Okay, but it's still an issue.
Let's take one more really, hopefully quick one.
When you were looking at deception, at which student group was responsible for the failure and whether there were differences in behavior due to that. So were the misbehaviors different for African American students when African American students had been the cause of the failure versus Hispanic or white or all?
Perhaps we should do moving forward, but we have not done that yet.
Okay, thank you for the question. So let's now move to Luke's presentation. Okay, so the work that I'm presenting, I'm trying to get the song from Sesame Street, "One of These Things Is Not Like the Other," out of my head. But it is, we are looking at teacher accountability policies that have been implemented at state and the federal level. And we are not doing regression discontinuity. I'm going to show you a bunch of lines that look at trends in various outcomes over time. And I'm going to be mapping on the implementation of these different policies to try to see if there may be a suggestive evidence that the trends that we see are connected to some of these policies. So this is joint work with Jim and Susanna, as well as Hamp Lankford up at University of Albany, and Andrew McEachin at North Carolina State. So these are two quotes that I believe that a lot of the teacher accountability policies are reacting to. So the George Bernard Shaw, "He who can does, he who cannot teaches." And then the second quote here saying, "Demeaning teachers fosters a diminished valuation of education as a whole, and ensures that smart, talented college grads will look elsewhere to use their skills." This is some evidence from another paper that shows that the academic ability of individuals who are choosing to become teachers has changed quite dramatically over these birth cohorts. And so the birth cohorts at the far left, you can think these are individuals who are becoming teachers in the mid-60s. And over here on the right are teachers who are individuals who are becoming teachers in the 80s. And what I'm showing here is the percent of those teachers who are coming from the top group of performers on some measure of ability. Baccalaureate is using the IQ test and the Air Force qualification test. And so the blue line is the top performers percent coming from the top, and the red is coming from the bottom. And what you see is back for the earlier cohorts here, we have about five times more teachers coming from the top scores than the bottom scoring group. And by the time we move out to those individuals who are entering in the 80s, we now have equal numbers coming from the top scores and the bottom scores. So there's a fair amount of literature that has looked at trends in academic abilities of individuals becoming teachers. So that there's been work that has looked at trends in SAT scores and ACT scores, and showed that individuals with higher scores are becoming less likely to enter teaching, and that the average academic ability measured by these different tests, standardized tests, have decreased between the 60s and the 90s. And a lot of this has been attributed to the fact that during this time, the employment opportunities for women have opened up, and that these other jobs have been luring away what may have been sort of a trapped, high-abled labor pool. Now, why are we talking about, why do we care about academic ability? Well, there's some evidence, some suggestive evidence that says that this may be related to the learning of students. But it also is suggestive of something to do with the status of the profession. And that many people look at these stylized trends and say this is evidence that the teaching suffers from a low status perception. And there have been a variety of proposals put forth to try to correct this, to raise the status of the profession, hoping to bring in people who have those skills that we need to help students meet their full potential. And these have to deal with things like compensation and working conditions, distribution of power and autonomy and control over budgets and curriculum. And also, where we'll be focusing on, is policies that have recommendations that we change the licensing and training of teachers to try to lure in more abled individuals. Now, our study is building on, sort of falls on the tails of a work that was released that Dan and his colleague Joe Walsh did
where they are also interested in saying, okay, well, we've had all these changes. Do we have any turnaround? And they find some suggestive evidence that there has been this turnaround since 2000 in academic ability of entering teachers. But we want to get, the data has some limitations to it, which I'll get to. We wanted to get more into this and be able to try to try to unpack this a bit. And so there has been a lot that has happened since 2000 and over this decade that could shape the reactions of individuals to the prospect of becoming a teacher. So that we've had a ratcheting up of teacher certification requirements. We've had an expansion of these alternative pathways into teaching. We've also had the nationwide implementation of the accountability and how they qualify teacher provisions of the No Child Left Behind. Now, there are different views on the sort of package of policies. There are the individuals who say this should help recruit highly abled individuals into the classroom because it emphasizes that teaching requires specialized knowledge and skills. And then there's the arguments against these policies that say that essentially posits that these teacher accountability policies are increasing barriers to entry, and it's feeding this mentality that we are blaming teachers for what we don't like about the way our schools are performing. So what I'll be presenting are again, it's suggestive evidence of the impact of these policies. We believe that our work, we're going to be using data from New York, which gets around some of the limitations that Dan's work had, in that they were able to look at differences over 3 different time points, one from the 90s, early 90s, around then 2000, and then 2009. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. We have annual data that we can tease that out. We also have the ability to disaggregate these trends across different schools, different communities, different grade levels within the state. But, of course, we only have New York data, whereas Dan's paper was really nice and he had national data. And we're going to be focusing on the certification cohorts between 1986 and 2010. So there are 3 questions that are motivating this work. How has the academic ability of entering teachers in New York changed over a 25-year period? Are these improvements? We do find improvements. The improvements that we find, are they widespread throughout the state, or are they narrowly focused in certain areas? And then again saying, okay, well, are there differences between labor markets, subjects, and school characteristics? So what this is showing you, this is the sort of timeline of the rollout of teacher accountability policies in New York State. So it gets kicked off in July of 1998 when the Board of Regents enacts a new teacher policy. Now this is 3.5 years before the No Child Left Behind law is signed. So they're ahead of that curve. They lay out how they're going to a timeline for the different things that they're doing. So they begin with they changed some regulations around preparation programs, and they do review and re-registration of those. I think 30% had to go through that process a couple times before they got their program reapproved, and there were a small number that actually never did. They also create the alternative certification program in 2000. The big thing, one of the publicized changes that they did is that they got rid of the temporary teaching license, these emergency teaching licenses, in September of 2003. They changed their requirements for their first and second stage license in February of 2004. The changes that they made to that first stage, which impacts the trends I'll show you, is that they moved a content specialty test from a requirement for the second stage license, which individuals need to get within 5 years, and made that a requirement of the first stage license. And then, of course, you have, in September of 2005, you have the highly qualified teacher provision kicking in. Okay, so the data we have, again, is from New York. We have data on the SAT scores for all public high school test takers between 1980 and 2008, and we standardized these within the year that the test was taken.
And we can link these test scores to the certification files and the teacher placement files from the New York State Department of Education. So we have, I'm going to be focusing on two groups. I'm focusing on individuals who are initially certified during the 1986 to 2010 period, and we have about 220,000 of them. And then also these initially hired individuals, I'll call these entering teachers, which is a subset of that first group. And then we have about a little over 150,000 of those individuals. And again, we're organizing these cohorts into certification cohorts based on the year that they received their initial certification. Now, we typically have SAT scores for about half of a cohort. Now, that may raise some initial concerns about, well, do we have a selective group, not a random subsample of that? We do some sensitivity checks, which I will hopefully present at the end if I have time, that actually suggest that maybe the improvements that that I'll show here are actually underestimated. Okay, so this is the first main takeaway. What this is showing you are two trend lines. So you have on the x-axis you have the certification cohorts, and on the y-axis you have the average standardized SAT score of that cohort. The light blue line is showing you the trends in the average SAT score for individuals who are certified, and then the dark blue line is for the individuals who are hired. What you see is that we also find, echoing prior research, we find a decrease in New York in academic ability of individuals through about 1998, 1999, which is when the New York State teacher policy is kicking in. And then we see some pretty significant increases. And so between 1999 and 2010, the average SAT score of an initially certified individual increases about 9% of a standard deviation. And when we're focused on individuals who are actually hired, brought into the classroom, these individuals who are in front of the students, the increase between that same period, 1999 to 2010, is about 27% of a standard deviation. I also want to point out that when these policies start kicking in around 2000 or so, that we now see that the individuals who are hired from the pool of potential teachers, they have higher average SAT scores than the full pool, which was different than in the earlier period. And that reflects either different hiring practices or different search efforts made by individuals over the time. Okay, so let me first say that we do not believe this is driven by changes in the labor market. So what this is showing you is that the dark line is the same line I had before. This is the average, the trends in the academic ability of entering teachers. And the light blue line is a regression-adjusted version of that, where we are counting for things like district enrollment, salaries, and the number of experienced and inexperienced teachers hired to try to remove the labor market dynamics effect here. And we see that those labor market dynamics may explain some of the decrease that we saw in the early period, but that it doesn't drive the increases in the later period. So what we then do, we shift from looking, so I'm now going to be focusing on entering teachers. This is showing you that we had a big decrease in the share coming from the bottom third and the top, and increase in share coming from the top. And now that right now in 2010, we have the modal teachers coming from the top third of the test score distribution. This is showing you the exact same trend lines. The percent of teachers coming from each tercile of the score distribution, just in New York City. And we see here that the percent coming from the top has increased 19 percentage points, and the share coming from the bottom third has decreased 19 percentage points. And again, we have the modal teacher in New York City coming from the top third. This is the trends. I want to highlight here that we see this kicking in, these increases kicking in when the alternative certification program kicks in, which is pretty much only in New York City. And again, we see another increase when we have the emergency certification program going away, which again was mostly focused in New York City and not in the rest of the state. So when we then look at these trend lines, but now for the rest of the state, we also see an increase in the share of entering teachers coming from the top. and a decrease in the share coming from the bottom, but that we see the effects delayed. We see it coming in more when the licensing changes kicked in, and then the highly qualified teacher provision. Now, as part of the No Child Left Behind Act, states were required to submit a plan that laid out their efforts that they would take to achieve a better distribution of teacher qualifications across schools. So what this is showing you the average SAT score of entering teachers by quintiles of school poverty. So when you focus on the green line, now these are the 20% of schools that have the highest concentrations of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch. We see a 55% of a standard deviation increase in the academic ability of teachers hired into those schools. Whoops, sorry. We see a 34% increase in the next poorest, least poor group. And then when you look at the schools that have the fewest poor students, so they had an 18%. So everybody's increasing, but that the group, we have dramatically narrowed the gap between in-academic ability of higher teachers across school poverty. So just to summarize some other findings, that's just one measure of academic ability. We also look at college competitiveness. We can do this through 2005 when we have decent data for this, and we see that the percent of teachers coming from the most competitive and the competitive undergraduate institutions are increasing, with decreases in the least competitive and non-competitive programs. We see that when we look outside of New York City and break those districts into rural, non-rural, urban, and city, that all geographic types of schools are increasing. I also want to emphasize this is not a TFA. This is not solely a TFA effect. So if we were to, when we go in and just look at individuals who graduated from the traditional preparation programs, that there was a 17% of a standard deviation increase in their SAT scores. So traditional preparation programs are playing an important role in the changes that we're seeing in New York State. Okay, so for sensitivity tests, there are three groups of individuals, of teachers, entering teachers, that we do not have represented in the trends that I've just showed you. These are private school test takers from the state, out-of-state test takers, and then individuals who didn't take any. When I'll jump down, I'll get 1 minute, I'll jump down to the college competitiveness. So here, the key thing here is that we have this for 88% of all individuals, all entering individuals, compared to about 54% of SATs. And that when we compare the percent coming of entering teachers coming from each level of competitiveness of the undergrad institution they attended, that after 2002, we see that the individuals who we do not have SAT scores are coming from more competitive colleges than the individuals who we do have SAT scores, suggesting that we are underestimating the trends in the improvements. Okay, so in terms of policy, this suggests that this package, we believe this evidence is strongly suggestive that this package of policies has led to an improvement in the academic ability of incoming teachers. We believe this is a signal that the status of the teaching profession is increasing, at least among folks who are choosing their career. And when we look at those trends, I highlight a couple of them where we would expect to see certain policies have a bigger bite. We can tease that out in the data, for instance, around the emergency certification and the alternative route programs in New York City. Thanks. So, first of all, thanks, Luke, for that nice presentation of your paper. Thanks also to you and your co-authors for writing a very thought-provoking paper, I think, on a topic that's of great policy interest. I think the trend over the last 10 to 15 years in many corners of education research has tended more and more towards these randomized experiments and fancy designs such as regression discontinuity. And obviously overall I think this has been great for boosting the rigor of education research, especially as it pertains to questions of causality. And certainly the two other papers that we have in the session are a testament to that. But I do worry a little sometimes if we've overcorrected, that the incentives are such now the researchers are a little more reluctant to look at some of these important issues if there's no way to kind of have an RCT or an RD or some other not just plausibly but almost surely exogenous source of identification. And I think in some policy practitioner circles, there may be a perception that maybe we've gone too far in pursuit of rigor at the expense of relevance. And so finding that balance point is key. And I don't think that's actually true in many cases, but I think there may be a little bit of that perception. So thanks again for writing this paper. I think it's a nice balance. And while it's a really complex topic to study rigorously, certainly it's really a relevant issue. So we know that teachers matter a lot as far as within school determinants of student achievement. So naturally, there's been a lot of policy making and research on improving the effectiveness of teachers. And this research and policy making seems to fall in a few major areas. So the first is, of course, giving more and better training to the teachers that you do have. This is through in-service professional development and pre-service teacher prep programs. You guys can all correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the evidence in this area has been not so promising so far. So that's one area. The second is better motivating the teachers that we do have to do a better job. And this is where you get things like, pay for performance systems, accountability, teacher evaluation systems, and obviously some of these are hybrid. They include supports as well. But just on sort of the pure accountability, these teachers just need an extra kick. Motivation. The evidence here has been so far a pretty mixed bag as well at best. Of course, the evidence is always evolving, so this is not to say that we won't figure out how to do these things eventually. But finally, the third, of course, is we can jump much earlier in the pipeline and attract more qualified people to the teaching profession. So, this is sort of like the Rick Hanishek idea of, if we take the bottom 10% to replace them, that could make a huge difference in of itself. So it's a little bit of a bodies issue. Do we have enough replacement bodies in the pool that would be better, right? So that's sort of been the approach taken by, organizations like Teach for America. Sure, they provide some training, but, it seems like it's heavily based on, who they select. And I know sort of at IES we've done a study recently looking at and showing that, TSAers actually do no worse and in some cases better than traditional teachers, even with ostensibly far less formal training. So this third area really is, I think, the focus of this paper. Have we more generally attracted higher ability people into teaching over time? And if so, why is that, or how did that come about? So with, of course, a caveat that, a single study can't and shouldn't be expected to do everything, here are some of my more specific reactions to the findings in this paper. So the first thing is that I hope to see, a little bit more on whether the trends in the data can be largely explained by macro fluctuations. I know you had a slide on this, and you ran some regressions controlling for things like district enrollment, hiring levels, and starting salaries, which apparently had some influence on the pre-1999 trends. That only seemed to be sort of skimming the surface of factors that could affect a person's decision to enter teaching. So in particular, it seems important to account for, broader issues of opportunity cost, such as, general labor market tightness and, the availability of alternatives. Certainly these factors you would expect to be correlated with some of the local teacher labor market indicators that you have, but maybe not as strong as you might want them to be. So the other thing is that parts of the paper seemed to focus on quantifying this overall change between starting in 1999 and ending in 2010, which I think sort of might exacerbate this concern because 1999 was close to sort of the height of a boom in the economy overall, and 2010 was, closer to sort of the bottom of a recession. So I thought that sort of unpacking this a bit more is important because I think it would speak more to whether this truly indicates a shift in the perceived status of teaching. and I know it's nice to sort of look at, sort of take a revealed preference approach and look at the actual behaviors of these teachers and what they're doing. But, since we're talking about the perceptions of the status of teaching, I also wonder if there's any information, if there's been any surveys just asking people, students in college, what they think of the status of teaching as a profession to maybe kind of corroborate this sort of trend in decision-making. It would also be nice, I think, if there were similar data, I don't know if this is the case, for entrance to other professions that maybe might compete with the teaching profession. More generally, while your main goal was, I think, to document the trends, it also seemed like you wanted to make a pretty strong argument that these changes are due to the various policies around New York's changes. And so given this, I was hoping for maybe a little bit more formal modeling of the trends and analyzing the data in a way that's maybe more similar to kind of like a formal comparative interrupted time series or something of that sort. But as it is, I find that there seemed to be a reasonably compelling case that something was kind of going on in this 2004 to 2010 period in particular that differed from prior years. So I think the question of why that might be and what the implications are is something that was a little bit less clear to me after reading the paper. And I think that despite the lots of suggestive evidence and the falsification tests that you provide for the various competing hypotheses, I think one should be a bit careful about attributing these trends to, a causal effect of New York's policies that sort of began in the late 1990s. So that's sort of one major point. The second is that say we're convinced that this was in fact a real status change for the teaching profession. I think then there is the interesting question of whether this is a permanent or persistent shift. And I'd be certainly eager to see in future work how these data look, even in the past 5 years, because a lot's happened since then. On the one hand, you have Department of Education initiatives like, the Teacher Ambassador Fellows Program and the Respect Project, which, those are all about involving teachers in policy discussions, making them feel more empowered and trying to ensure that teaching is a highly respected and supported profession. So on the other hand, you have a big push to expand teacher evaluation systems. You got the whole debate on using value added in student achievement to reward and to punish teachers. You've got court cases over teacher tenure laws. You've got strikes and protests over teacher contracts and benefits. Lots of controversy over plans to rate and rank teacher preparation programs. And this is all sort of in the context of the last 5 years of, pretty flat or falling levels of education funding overall. So I think this was mentioned earlier. I think some of this could go either way. So, for example, this could drive public perception that teachers are a big part of the education problem, which may not reflect so well on the profession and might reinforce some of these negative stereotypes about teachers. On the other hand, it could engender sympathy for teachers if they're being unfairly dumped on. Or it could, push the perception that these are good efforts to try to further professionalize the teaching workforce, whether it's through these accountability systems or demanding improvements in teacher preparation programs, for example. So it's maybe not so clear where we stand today, but I think if I were a policymaker, that certainly would be something that I want to know about to see whether, these trends have kind of evolved even in the last 5 years. So third is related to the issue of these permanent or persistent changes. So what about the question of teacher retention and attrition? So the focus of your data is really obviously on new entrants to teaching, and these new entrants are higher ability than before. But I think there's still a question of whether their retention and attrition patterns are similar to the lower ability teachers that they essentially replaced, right? So I think this might speak to whether these trends really could have meaningful and sustained changes to teaching and learning. And I know this is something that you kind of briefly alluded to in your paper, but that's certainly something that jumped out in me as something that's interesting and important. Finally, more on the issue of meaningful and sustained changes in teaching and learning. So what your data show is that there's a larger proportion of teachers coming from the top third of the SAT distribution and a smaller proportion of teachers coming from the bottom third. Now that seems pretty substantial, right? But I think ultimately what we'd like to know, at least as a next step, is how that might translate to changes in teacher effectiveness and student achievement. So you noted that there is some correlation, however weak, with these ability indicators and student achievement. I wonder if there then is a way to kind of use this information to maybe predict how these changes might translate to changes in student achievement, and then see how closely that maps to the actual observed changes in student achievement. I realize that your data only look at new entrants and certainly not the stock of all existing teachers in a given year. So obviously there need to be assumptions about retention patterns and whatnot. And maybe you've already all thought about this and it's too complex and infeasible, but I think that would be an issue worth thinking about if you haven't already. Let's see. Also, the focus of NCLB was on having highly qualified teachers. Even though it seems like the correlations between some of those indicators and student outcomes seem pretty weak. More recently, though, there's been a shift towards focusing on highly effective teachers, which factors in things like value added. So I think we need to be a little careful here. So, for example, one of your findings that the ability jump in new teachers was most pronounced in high poverty schools. So presumably that's good news for closing this gap. But I know sort of like in one of our recent IES studies that looked at the distribution of effective teachers, we actually found that on average disadvantaged students still get less effective teaching. So now I think your data are not inconsistent with that finding, because even though you show that high poverty schools are catching up over time, there's still that gap there. Although I think there's another paper by Tim Sass and co-authors that looked at maybe an earlier set of years looking at the differences in effective teachers and still found that there was a similar gap in the early 2000s with the later 2000s. So this is just to say that there potentially is an important distinction between high ability as measured by something like SAT scores and highly effective as measured by something like value-added scores. And so this really, I think, raises the question of whether these changes in highly able teachers have actually translated into similar changes in highly effective teachers. So in sum, I think that certainly more research is needed before I would feel comfortable recommending actionable policy or practice. But this is not really criticism. It's not unusual because it seemed very perilous to rely on any single study to drive policy or practice, no matter what the study is. But with all that said, I'd like to thank you for the study. I think it's an important topic. I think it's that you've been pretty thoughtful about the nuances and complexities, and I think you've definitely documented some compelling and interesting trends and generated some worthy hypotheses that will hopefully inspire additional work to get us closer to the causes and consequences of these trends. Thank you.
Questions from the group, and then we'll break for lunch.
Perfect. 3 questions. All right. Which one? 3 questions. Okay. All right. I'm here.
Sure. Thanks. I'll be quick. I'm Steve Hemholt from UNC. I have a closely related question to what you just commented on for Luke's paper. I'm intrigued by the trends between the low and high poverty schools, and I'm wondering if you have a sense of if you reproduce that same graph for teachers in their 3rd year, so among those who remain in their, say, 3rd year, after which a sizable share of high ability teachers, both through TFA and traditional routes, leave, would you see the same closing? Do you have a hypothesis about that?
So we've done some look. We've begun looking at the retention issue, and when we look at groups of teachers, groups of cohorts, and we're looking at the differential retention of the teachers from the bottom third, middle third, and top third of the score distribution, we do not see huge changes in the retention patterns over time as we move out the cohorts. So it doesn't. So I interpret that as that it does not seem that the state is doing a better job of getting achieving high ability individuals into the classroom just to increase churning going on, which as someone as Danielle commented earlier, could be good, could be bad, but there doesn't seem so. Based on that, I would think that if we moved out to looking at teachers in the third year, that we would still see a narrowing.
So, Luke, I wonder if you could address Tom's concern about the macroeconomic factors, which was also my concern, by doing a falsification test where you look at the SAT scores of another kind of public sector employee that is also college educated, where you would not see that kind of accountability pressure?
So that would be awesome. To do that, right, so we could do that if we could link the SAT information up to, I guess, UI records to say, okay, these individuals, what kind of jobs are they going into? And there's some financial reasons why we haven't done that yet. But for sure, there are this, as Tom mentioned, at the very least, it generates a bunch of really interesting hypotheses that are worthy of testing. The connection to the teaching effectiveness is one that we have thought a lot about, not this way. That may be some interesting attraction here.
One final question? Anyone?
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you first to the panel. Thank you.